Okay, welcome everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see a lot of names on here that I recognize. We have a board member, we have some longtime supporters, some friends of colleagues of ours. It's really great to have you all with us this evening. I'm Gwen Thompson. I'm the Executive Director here at the Mary Todd Lincoln House, and we're pleased that you could join us for this virtual program about Katherine Helm, Artist of the Bluegrass. Before I introduce our team, I want to go over a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. You might have noticed that everyone has been muted upon entry, and we'll ask that you mute yourself throughout the program. You may need to adjust your screen view so that you can see everything on each PowerPoint slide. And to adjust your view, you can go to the top right-hand corner of your screen, click View, and select one of the options, and we recommend side-by-side gallery. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, we ask that you please post those in the chat feature, and we'll answer all your questions at the end. You should be able to find that chat feature at the bottom of your screen in the middle of the Zoom taskbar. This evening, we're joined by our Education Coordinator, Vicki Middlesworth, who will help us answer your questions. And our presenter is Mary Todd Lincoln House Assistant Director, Kate Hesseldenz. Among her many talents, Kate's undergraduate degree is actually in art history, and that makes her particularly qualified to research and present this evening's program, Katherine Helm, Artist of the Bluegrass. So with no further ado, Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Gwen. So I really first got interested in Katherine Helm a few years back when I researched the 6 portraits she did of her Aunt Mary Todd Lincoln. And there isn't much written about her, but there is a small booklet by a man named William Townsend. It's about 13 pages, and it's entitled Lincoln's Rebel Niece, Katherine Helm, Artist and Author. And this is from 1945. That's really about all there is. So I kind of used it as my jumping off point for this talk, but I really relied heavily on period newspaper articles to kind of inform the lecture. I also felt an affinity with Katherine, as we share the same first name, and I spell my name the same as hers. And of course, she has the same initial last name, so we're both KH. And she did go by Kate sometimes, but I'm going to refer to her as Katherine in this lecture. So really the talk is an attempt to fill in some of the gaps in the life and work of Katherine Helm. And I'm sure it's just really going to scratch the surface because there's a lot out there that we can, learn about her, more to learn. So Katherine Riley Helm was born on September 2nd, 1857 in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. She's a professional artist who worked in oils, watercolors, pastel, and crayon. She painted portraits and landscapes. She also wrote an early biography of Mary Todd Lincoln. She is the daughter of Emily Todd Helm, which is Mary Todd Lincoln's half-sister, and Benjamin Hardin Helm. Her parents were married in 1856, and she was the oldest of 3 children. Her younger siblings were named Elodie and Ben. Her father was a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he fought in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, rising to the rank of brigadier general. And he died at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863. So a 6-year-old Katherine and her mother Emily visited the Lincolns in the White House after her dad's funeral. During this visit, a story about an encounter between Tad Lincoln, the 4th son of Mary and Abraham, and Katherine illustrate the divided allegiances of the Helm and Lincoln families during the Civil War. So the family story goes that Tad showed Katherine some photographs, and he showed her a photo of Abraham Lincoln and said, "This is the president." To which Katherine said, "No, that is not the president. Mr. Davis is the president." So supposedly Abraham Lincoln witnessed this argument and said, "Well, Tad, you know who your president is, and I am your little cousin's Uncle Lincoln." So Katherine and her family continued to be sympathetic to the Confederate cause for the rest of their lives, and they often attended meetings that commemorated the former Confederacy. So after the Civil War, Emily and her children lived with her mother, Betsy Todd, at Buena Vista. This is the Todd's country home. This was in Franklin County, Kentucky. But then in 1866, they moved also with Betsy to Madison, Indiana. Catherine attended Miss Lydia Rutledge's Episcopal School and Miss Mary McFetteridge's School of Higher Education. From an early age, Catherine showed an interest in art and a talent for drawing and painting with watercolors. When she was 10 years old, she painted a life-size painting of her mother, Emily, and that's a print of that painting there on the screen. Around this time, she also drew a crayon sketch of Buena Vista. I know that's around somewhere, but we don't have a picture of it. So while she was in Madison, she studied art with William McKendry Schneider. He was an Indiana-based artist known for portraits and forest interior landscapes. And the painting on the right is likely done by Catherine. I think it kind of resembles Schneider's work, and this could be an early piece. By 1876, the Helms had moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where Emily was a piano teacher and Catherine, now in her late teens, attended Miss Knowles' School for Girls. By 1880, the family had moved yet again, this time to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where Emily and Ben had begun their married life. Catherine, now 21 years old, identifies as an artist. On the 1880 census, her occupation is listed as a portrait painter. And she was painting portraits by this time. A Louisville Courier Journal article from August of 1880 reported that Miss Kate Helm is painting a new style of plaques that are a strikingly original conception, and these are described as small head and shoulders portraits painted on wood board. I wasn't able to find any examples of those, but we do have a few in our collection, portrait miniatures painted by Catherine, and this one on the screen there is thought to be a self-portrait. So in the 1880s and 1890s, Catherine studied art at the Art Students League in New York City. From the 1870s on, there were more opportunities for women artists to study in formal classroom settings like the Art Students League, where they received professional training in the fine arts. The League was an art school founded by artists in 1875, about 10 years before Catherine attended. The artists who founded the League had once been associated with the National Academy of Design, but found the Academy's instruction to be too conservative, and many of the students at the League were women. Alternative teaching venues such as the League and the Society of American Artists, which was established in 1877, enabled women and artists of color to achieve enhanced professional stature. However, many of the classes did remain segregated by sex. They're still bound by the societal norms of the day. So the next 3 slides I'm going to show, they contain mild nudity. And if you prefer not to see that, you can look away. I will let you know when those aren't on the screen anymore. So life drawing and portraiture were foundational parts of the Art Student League's program. And also in this slide, you can see this is all women in this class. This is a little later, after 1905. Catherine was not there, not in school then, but it's still segregated class there. And these are from Katherine Helm's sketchbook when she was a student at the League. And then you can really see that she's drawing from life, trying to master the human form, and she even drew a human skeleton there. She was also drawing classical figures in a class known as antique drawing. The students in this class drew from plaster casts of classical Greek statues. Plaster casts were sourced in Europe, and they were fundamental teaching tools in 19th century art instruction. And you can see the one Catherine drew here. I think it really looks a lot like this one in this picture from 1900. Okay, so if you weren't watching the PowerPoint, you can do so again. So William Merritt Chase, he's an American Impressionist artist. He was a very, very popular teacher while Catherine was a student at the League. She mentions him in an 1886 letter to her sister Elodie, describing her life as an art student. I paint standing from 9 until 12 in the morning in Mr. Chase's class, and from 1:30 until sometimes 6, draw for interior decoration in Mr. Tuckerman's class, and study architecture every night until 10 o'clock. So far, I have preserved only 2 studies. I paint out the canvas as soon as I paint it in. Mr. Chase piles on paint, gets the effect very quickly. It is perfectly fascinating. So Catherine studied in New York for about 6 years, although they don't appear to be consecutive years. And as this letter shows, she was taking painting classes, but she was also taking architecture, and that training is going to come into play later in her life. I'll talk about how she utilized that. William Merritt Chase was known to be particularly encouraging of his female students and trained them no differently than the male students, writing once that genius has no sex. And Chase is really one of the best American portrait painters from this time. On the right side of the slide, there is a portrait he did of his daughter, Alice. He taught a lot of artists. Catherine was really fortunate to train with him. I think she was lucky to have been mentored by a teacher who gave women the confidence to pursue a professional career. So back in Elizabethtown by the late 1880s, a newspaper article reported that Catherine is recently returned from New York City and will be taking orders for portraits. As a portrait painter, Catherine painted from life, but also created portraits based on photographs. And her sitters included immediate family members, such as her brother Bernhard Helm, who's pictured there on the right, and then her sister in profile over here, Elodie Helm Lewis, and other relatives. She also painted people with her circle of friends and high society individuals such as Margaretta Brown Barrett of Louisville, Sarah Humphrey Chenault Buckner of Lexington, and Mrs. Lucy Alexander of Woodburn Farm in Versailles. And this is a portrait she did of Sarah Humphrey Chenault Buckner, and then there's a photograph there from a newspaper society page. In the spring of 1890, Catherine spent 2 months in Winchester, Kentucky, painting a group portrait of the Beckner family. Some of these family members may have painted from life, but some from photographs. From daguerreotypes, she painted her father, General Benjamin Hardin Helm, and her mother, Emily. And pictured here is a daguerreotype from a Ben from about 1861, and then Catherine's portrait of him there on the right. And this is a portrait miniature she did of her mother based on a daguerreotype from 1854. So Emily had visited her sister Mary and brother-in-law Abraham Lincoln in Springfield in 1854 through 1855, and she sat for this picture. And she is wearing a bonnet that prompted Mary Lincoln to purchase her a new one because Mary found it unattractive. So Catherine recalls this in a letter, and she said, Aunt Mary pronounced her mother's bonnet very unbecoming. And she and brother Abraham sent off to Philadelphia for a white velvet bonnet smothered in white plumes. So this is the picture, the bonnet here is the one that Mary Lincoln did not like. So by 1889, Catherine was showing her work at Escott's Gallery in Louisville. At this time, she maintained a studio in Elizabethtown that I think was probably out of the residence she shared with her family, who were still living there at that time. And on November 7th, that's the same day as today, 1895, she held a reception at her studio, and the Elizabethtown News Enterprise newspaper reported that 100 guests attended to see her portraits, animal paintings, and watercolors. And the paper said that her watercolors attracted the most attention and admiration, and a number were sold. So this is an illustration that appeared in December 1895 in the Louisville Courier-Journal, showing Catherine's Elizabethtown studio. And you can see like the dogs that they talked about, the animal paintings. There's some landscapes here and some portraits. And I think these maybe are representative of what she might have had in that reception. So there's an Irish setter and then a landscape over here. So those might be close to what she had. So Katherine had a short interlude out of the Bluegrass region when she spent the fall of 1890 and 1891 in Middlesboro, Kentucky, with her friend Florence Barlow. Helm had a studio there and offered art lessons in portraiture in oil, crayon, and pastel. She was also painting landscapes of the Cumberland Mountains. As one newspaper reported, she was painting the glories of the Cumberland Mountains in all their autumn coloring. So when Katherine arrived to Middlesboro, it had been recently developed and dubbed the Magic City. The developer, Alexander Arthur, wished to turn the wilderness of the Yellow Creek Valley into an industrial boomtown by taking advantage of the coal and iron deposits that were in the area. And so British investors funded Arthur's project and named the town after one in England. So on the screen, you see that English spelling. It's also on that cabinet card picture there of Katherine. And in 1894, the name was shortened to the current spelling of Middlesboro that dropped the UGH at the end of the name there. So a fire in late 1890, possibly when Katherine was there, and the Panic of 1893, among other things, led to the failure of Arthur's project. So it was kind of a short-lived detour for Katherine as well. I didn't understand why she was in Middlesboro, but then it makes sense when we learned about this boomtown situation. In the winter of 1891, Katherine traveled to New York City to study again at the Art Students League, and this time she studied with Augustus St. Gaudens. And since St. Gaudens was a sculptor, he was also a teacher. It's likely that Katherine tried her hand at sculpture, although I don't have any evidence of that. I don't know. I don't have any of her work. But I'm guessing it was something like, if you can see these two women down here, they're making like a low relief sculpture. So I think it might have been something like that she was doing when she worked with him. And it's interesting because St. Gaudens, he had some Lincoln connections. He had completed a statue of Abraham in 1887, and that sculpture is located in Lincoln Park in Chicago. And Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham and Mary's only surviving son, is thought to have said it was the best portrait of his father. And prior to that, in 1886, St. Gaudens made bronze and plaster casts after Leonard Volk's original 1860 plaster casts of Abraham Lincoln's face and hands. Now, maybe there was a connection because of Lincoln. I'm not sure. It could have been, or maybe she just wanted to go back to art school. So in 1892, Katherine was chosen by her peers as one of the most prominent Kentucky women in a contest held by the Lexington School Journal magazine. The editor, Ora Cravens, asked the public to submit names, and Katherine was among the 20 chosen. Other women chosen were sculptor Enid Yandel, suffragist Laura Clay, and Louisville socialite Sally Ward. The magazine's description of her, it's on the screen there, but it is Miss Katherine Helm, who has friends without number in the capital of the Bluegrass, has made quite a reputation as an artist. Her decided and early marks of talent attracted the attention of many noted Kentuckians. And then in the late 1880s and 1890s, Katherine's portrait work received some attention and praise in the Kentucky newspapers. And this first one is describing a portrait, said, not only is the portrait a very close one, but the artistic pose and the coloring are perfect, showing the high cultivation Miss Helm has received since she returned from art school in the East. That's from 1889. And then this one is Miss Helm is now busy filling Kentucky orders for portraits. That's from 1892. And then this last one here is Ms. Helm takes first rank among the artists of the state, and in portrait work, it is doubtful she has an equal in Kentucky. Now that one's from 1895. It's also from the Elizabethtown newspaper, where kind of her hometown, and I'm sure she had an equal in the state, but they are very proud of her in that. So in the 1890s, Katherine routinely wintered in New York and spent the summers in Kentucky. This arrangement really began when she was a student at Art Students League, and she continued to spend part of the year in New York into the early years of the 20th century. In 1896, she established a studio, and it was in Midtown Manhattan. Some of Catherine's friends in the city were also from Kentucky, and one friend that she spent time with in New York was a woman named Nanny Mayo Fitzhugh, and she was a poet from Lexington. So Catherine visited Kentucky each summer, and she would stay with her mother, who was now in Louisville, or her now married sister, Elodie, and brother-in-law, Waller Lewis. And they had a farm in Franklin County, named Woodlake. So while she was successful in the Bluegrass region, one Kentucky newspaper boasted that she was also a hit in New York, stating that Miss Helm had a studio last winter in New York and was successful beyond all expectation. She also occasionally wintered in New Orleans around this time. And so when she was in Louisiana, she was a guest of New Orleans artist Lulu King Saxon. And the Helm family owned a few of Saxon's works, and that watercolor was owned by the Helms. And it's possible that she gifted them to Catherine. So while in New Orleans, Catherine exhibited work in conjunction with the Artists Association of New Orleans, and her landscape entitled A Green Bank was mentioned in one of their papers, the Picayune, as one of the simplest and most attractive canvases in the exhibition. And since her family remained involved in post-Civil War Confederate memorializing activities, it really isn't surprising that Catherine was commissioned by Confederate organizations to paint portraits of Southern leaders. In 1900, she was commissioned by the Daughters of the Confederacy at the New Orleans chapter to create a portrait of U.S. Senator Randall Gibson from Louisiana, who also served as a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. And then in 1903, Helm was chosen by the Jefferson Davis Memorial Association to create a painting of Confederate President Davis. She painted the Davis portrait in her studio in New York and consulted with his widow, Verena, who was then living in the city. And both paintings were unveiled at Memorial Hall in New Orleans, which is now a museum with artifacts relating to the Confederate States of America and the American Civil War. And I suspect those paintings are still there, but I was unable to locate them or find images of the paintings. So Catherine also painted portraits of former governors and political figures from her home state. And one example of this is her portrait of Kentucky Governor John LaRue Helm, who was also her grandfather. Helm served as governor from 1850 to 1851, and then briefly again in 1867. He died 5 days after he was sworn in as Kentucky's 24th governor. And then Benjamin Hardin there in the middle. He was an early Kentucky legislator. He was her great-grandfather and also the namesake of her father, Benjamin Hardin Helm. That portrait is said to have been created. She copied a pencil sketch of him. And then the one there on the right, the far right, is Governor James Proctor Knott, and she painted that one from life. And he was the governor of Kentucky from 1883 to 1887. And then James Proctor Knott was also a relative of the Helm family, and he and Catherine wrote each other frequently in the 1880s and 1890s, and they referred to each other as cousin. I'm not sure how they were related, but they were somehow. So he was an artist himself, and these are just some pieces that he did that are in the Western Kentucky University collection. And he really encouraged her in her profession as an artist. So the J. Proctor Knott and the John LaRue Helm portraits were both acquired in 1907 by the Kentucky Historical Society for the Hall of Fame at the new Capitol. And again in 1908, Helm was commissioned by the Kentucky Historical Society to paint another former governor, Joseph Deshea, for the Hall of Fame wall. And he served as governor from 1824 to 1828. So the Hall of Fame space contained portraits, artifacts, and other items of historical interest. The Capitol building, which is our current Capitol, was completed in 1910. And so that was, this was within that. And there's a little picture there of that room. And along this wall, I think is what it was the Hall of Fame wall. I think I can even see that's Proctor. But this was dismantled in 1953, and the paintings are currently at the Kentucky Historical Society down in Frankfort. A lot of them are probably in the Hall of Governors there, on display. So in some instances, Katherine painted copies of portraits done by other artists, and a copy of her grandfather's portrait by John Nagel is an example of this. So the one on the right is a copy of Robert Smith Todd, from the original there on the left, and these are both at the Mary Todd Lincoln House. And then Mary Brown Humphreys, that was Catherine's great grandmother. She created the portrait on the right after Matthew Harris Jewett's original painting there on the left. Another one like this is a copy of a circa 1863 portrait of her father, Benjamin Hardin Helm, by David Bentham, and to the right is Catherine's copy. In 1905, Katherine closed her New York studio and she returned to Kentucky. So from 1907 to around 1911, Katherine had a studio in the same house in Louisville where she lived with her mother, Emily. And this is that the house is still standing. This house is in the neighborhood known as Old Louisville. In 1907, Katherine participated in the Southern Electrical and Industrial Exposition held at the Armory in Louisville. And at that exposition, Katherine's works were exhibited alongside other Louisville-based women artists that included Sophia DeButts-Gray and Mary McPherson, and Roberta McLean and Patty Thum. McLean and Thum also studied at the Art Students League with William Merritt Chase. In 1911, a few of Katherine's paintings were exhibited in the Teaching Art Gallery of the Kentucky Federation of Women's Clubs, along with work by Enid Yandel and Hattie Hutchcraft Hill. And in 1915, Katherine participated with 39 artists in an exhibit held in Lexington in connection with the Women's Club's annual meeting. And among the artists represented were Charles Sneed Williams, who would later paint Abraham Lincoln. That's from 1932, I think. And then also Paul Sawyer, and Sawyer is best known for his watercolor landscapes of the Bluegrass. And he also studied with William Merritt Chase at the Art Students League. He was there after Katherine was there. Another well-known Kentucky artist from the late 19th century that Katherine knew was Robert Burns Wilson. Now, Wilson is best known for his Kentucky landscapes that are often kind of romantic and atmospheric. She liked his work, and around 1898, Wilson painted a landscape with a cabin and gave it to Katherine. The cabin was personal to her as it represented one that she knew from her childhood. And it could have been from the country home of her grandparents near Frankfort. The landscape with the cabin pictured here was owned by the Helm family, and it could have been the painting, but I'm not really sure. This isn't a great picture, but you can see the cabin down here. And then this could be the Elkhorn Creek that was close by that property. So, but I'm not sure if that's the one or not. So like Katherine, Robert Burns Wilson and Paul Sawyer moved from Kentucky to New York for greater artistic opportunities and for a larger market to sell their work. And really after the Civil War, the modern art world really had emerged in New York City, and a lot of these late 19th century artists looked to New York as the capital of the American art world. I mean, now it's an international art world. But Wilson moved there in 1903 and Paul Sawyer like 10 years later in 1913. So Katherine actually would have overlapped with Robert Burns Wilson by a couple of years there. So who knows, they might have hooked up in New York hanging out. So in 1912, Emily Todd Helm bought a farm in Lexington on Bowman Mill Road and named it Helm Place in honor of her late husband's ancestral home in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. For the next 5 years, Katherine and her sister Elodie, who was now widowed, managed the farm. And their brother Ben, he was away a lot. He worked in the railroad business and was often away. He did retire in 1917, and then that's when Katherine returned to painting, and she converted the home place, third floor attic space, into her studio. It was at Helm Place that Katherine painted 6 portraits of Mary Todd Lincoln from 1925 to 1929. These portraits were based on photographs of Mary and also recollections of her about her from people who knew her. So the impetus to create these came from Mary Harlan Lincoln. This is the wife of Robert Todd Lincoln. And Lincoln was close with his Aunt Emily and her children, Ben, Catherine, and Elodie, who were his first cousins. The Helms and the Lincolns wrote to each other frequently and visited each other. Mary Harlan and Robert Lincoln split their time living in a home in Washington, D.C., and also one in Vermont. When Mary Harlan read a local Washington newspaper article about how First Lady Grace Coolidge was planning to refurbish the area where the First Lady's portrait hung, she came up with the idea that Catherine should paint a Mary Todd Lincoln portrait, as there wasn't one of her mother-in-law at the White House. So Mary Harlan asked for permission from the president and Mrs. Coolidge, and they approved of the undertaking. So here's the first one that Catherine painted, and this was intended as a surprise gift for for Robert and Mary Harlan. And it shows Mary Lincoln with a string of pearls running through the fingers of her right hand. This represents her in 1937 when she was about 19 years old. We have a picture of this one, but I'm not sure where this painting actually ended up. And then the second one is the one that Robert and Mary and Catherine concluded would be the most appropriate for the White House. And it represents Mary in 1861. It's still part of the White House collection. And on the right there, you can see a Matthew Brady photograph of Mary Lincoln from 1861. And you can see the similarities where she's, got this, there's a fan in her hand there, fan in her hand, the flowers in the hair, and also the decorations there on her dress. So this third one represents Mary in 1839 when she first met Abraham, and Catherine's posing with the posing with the portrait in the picture to the right. This one is owned by the Mary Todd Lincoln House, and it's currently on display at the house. So these first three ones were all actually taken to Washington as possibilities for the White House, but then, of course, that second one was the one that ended up being chosen. So publicity about the portraits led Catherine to take commissions for further paintings of Mary Lincoln. And the first was for Lincoln scholar and collector, Dr. William Barton. And it appears on the cover of his book, entitled The Women Lincoln Loved. She also did a portrait, Catherine did a portrait of Abraham Lincoln for Barton. And that's that one there on the right. It's meant to represent Lincoln in about 1847. And the two portraits can be seen in these photographs from an exhibit in 1934 of the Barton collection that was at the University of Chicago. So you can see that one of Mary over here on the left. So Barton paid $300 for the pair of paintings, and I thought it was really interesting because Barton offered Catherine $50 per portrait, but she countered that offer and she asked for more, and in the end, she charged him $150 per portrait. Another portrait was commissioned by Harry E. Bullock. He was a Lincoln Memorial University alumnus and trustee. This portrait is meant to represent Mary in 1839 when she first met Abraham. It's really similar to the one owned by the Mary Todd Lincoln House. And Bullock later donated this one to LMU. And then the last commission came from William Townsend, who was another Lincoln collector and scholar. And he lived in Lexington and was friendly with the Helm family. And he's the one that I mentioned earlier, wrote the short booklet about Catherine from 1945. And this portrait shows Mary with pearls in her left hand. It's very similar to the first one I showed you, where she holds the pearls in the opposite hand. And this one appears in Townsend's book, Lincoln and His Wife's Hometown. And then there's William Townsend there at his Mental Park home in Lexington with the portrait. So Catherine's landscapes include murals that she painted on the walls of Helm Place. She painted a panoramic mural of Elkhorn Creek on the dining room walls, and you can see it in this picture here. It's on the top half of the walls there. And that creek is very near Helm Place. It's just across Bowman Mill Road, and this is a nice detail of that mural. She also painted 4 scenes over the mantels in the second floor bedrooms of Helm Place. And 2 of the mantelpiece paintings include female figures that resemble nymphs or goddesses. You can see them right here and a little bit here. This picture is a little bit dark. But these two landscapes are really reminiscent of Camille Corot's Dance of the Nymphs from 1860. Corot died in 1875. He was a French landscape and portrait painter, and he was said to have influenced Catherine's style. I think you can really see it in these. It looks kind of similar. So Catherine's landscape work is pretty representational most of the time, and you can tell that in these two oils that she did. One of a Kentucky cabin, and then this one is she titled the Old Garden. But in these landscapes that she did in watercolor, she seems to really be experimenting a little here. The brushwork's a bit looser, the trees and water depicted in these watercolors seem to be a little bit more about her interpretation and less of what she might have actually been seeing. And as I mentioned before, Catherine admired the work of Robert Burns Wilson, and I think she kind of emulates his style in some of her landscapes. And on the slide is a watercolor. This is Wilson on the top, and the one on the bottom is Catherine. And they both are actually, this is a sunrise, I think. This could be a sunrise or a sunset, so it's kind of interesting. But I think the way she does her trees, the execution of the trees is very similar to Wilson's in this landscape. So before I mentioned that Catherine studied architecture as well as art while she was in New York, and some of her sketchbooks show pictures and diagrams of houses that she drew. And she also designed an addition to Helm Place. So she drew up plans for that dining room that has the murals, the one I just showed. That dining room kind of enclosed the kitchen with the porch. She also designed two bathrooms in Helm Place and enclosed part of an upstairs hall to make a small bedroom. And this is the small bedroom. She in that bedroom, she painted several kind of pastel colored landscape mural insets in the wall. So not only was she a painter and an amateur architect, she was also a published author. And in 1928, she published The True Story of Mary, Wife of Lincoln. Catherine wasn't completely new to writing, as she was known to write limericks and short stories. So this biography about her Aunt Mary is based on family recollections, including her mother, Emily Todd Helm's wartime diary. The motivation to write the biography came from Mary Harlan Lincoln, and the book is dedicated to her. And Mary Harlan's daughter, Jessie, explained this in a letter. She said, "The treatment of my grandmother Lincoln was a very painful subject to my mother, and it was due to her urging that my cousin, Katherine Helm, wrote The True Story of Mary, Wife of Lincoln." So Abraham Lincoln's former law partner, William Herndon, famously wrote an unflattering portrayal of Mary in his 1889 book, Herndon's Lincoln, The True Story of a Great Life. Catherine felt obliged to write the book to counter negative impressions of Mary, such as this. And in a letter to Judge Oakleaf, this is another Lincoln collector, Catherine explained it herself. She said, "Only fantastic and inaccurate accounts have reached the public of my Aunt Mrs. Lincoln, that I feel it my duty to record any facts remembered by by my mother or documents in her possession bearing on the subject." So prior to the book's publication, it appeared in installments in McCall's magazine in the summer of 1928. McCall's magazine offered Catherine $10,000 for the serialization of the book. That's equivalent to about $185,000 in today's money. And then her book was published in the fall of that same year, 1928, by Harper and Brothers Publishers, and the book sold for $4. And then she was to receive $500 for finishing the manuscript, and then 10% for the first 5,000 copies sold, and then 15% on copies sold thereafter. So I think she would have received about $2,500 after the first 5,000 copies were sold. So the reviews of the book were pretty generally favorable. One critic disliked the writing, feeling it was kind of sentimental. Ida Tarbell, who was an investigative journalist and a Lincoln scholar, who had been in communication with Catherine leading up to the book's publication, criticized the book's tone as being so toddish. She felt that the book explains many things in a way that possibly Miss Helm cannot be expected to understand. She's likely referring to how Mary's story is only told from the perspective of the Todd's family, and therefore doesn't reflect the full historical context. Tarbell did, however, say that she was thankful for the book and thought it could modify the hateful, partisan pictures of Mary Lincoln that have been so long accepted. While also an author, Katherine Helm was really an artist first and foremost. She created innumerable portraits and paintings over a 50-year career. Since she was a woman artist working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some have assumed that she was not a serious artist. She likely has been characterized as a mere dabbler in paint or a Sunday painter. An 1883 letter in the Louisville Courier Journal, written by a New Yorker, reinforces this view of aspiring women artists. The author wrote that there were too many so called artists around New York, and that this amateur talent seems to be rampant among the women. This critic of women artists goes on further to say they are all dabbling in oils. And Katherine Helm was not a dabbler in oil. She was a professionally trained artist who sold her art for most of her adult life. She never married, and it is possible that she chose not to marry, instead devoting her time to her art. Or she may have shared the sentiment of her brother Ben, who never married because he intended to take care of his mother and sisters. Perhaps Catherine, like Ben, was committed to caring for their mother. Emily Todd Helm never married again after the death of their father. So Catherine died on June 18th, 1937 at Helm Place, possibly of colon cancer. She was 79 years old, and she is buried in the Lexington Cemetery in the Todd plot. Katherine Helm did not receive national attention for her art, and she's not listed in any directories of American women artists. Rather, she's best remembered as an artist from the Bluegrass region of Kentucky. Okay, I'm going to
Hi.
some questions.
Yeah. Well, Kate, I want to thank you for sharing all of your research with us and for really shining a light on this somewhat forgotten Kentucky woman who's really quite an incredible artist and had a very interesting career. We do have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
First up is from our friend Rebecca. She asks, so as a young single woman, where did Catherine stay when she wintered in New York? And I suppose that question also applies to whenever she was, studying
Yeah,
early on too. Yeah.
no, that's a good question. And I didn't find any, addresses when she was in New York. The only time there was an address was when she had that studio from like 1896 to 1905, and she was in Midtown, but I don't really know. Yeah, not sure.
So we don't know whether she was sharing a flat with anyone or living solo. It's a bit of a
Well,
mystery.
it's kind of a mystery, yeah. Still, yeah, it would be, I did wonder that myself.
Okay. Perry had a question, and you touched on it a little bit. He said, "What did people, or he, she, they, Perry, what did people typically pay for self or family portraits?"
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. And then, some artists, well, you know, William Merritt Chase, who was bigger, more high profile artist, he could have charged probably like $2,000. I think I read that somewhere for his stuff. Whereas, the one that we did find, I found for that Mary Lincoln portrait she was charged, it was a smaller portrait than some she did. That was 150, and that was, in the 20s. So yeah, I think, that's the only evidence I found, but I do think like some of the more prominent artists could have charged a lot more than she was charging.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you mentioned that Lincoln scholar Barton paid $150 for each of the portraits that he commissioned
Yeah.
from her.
Those weren't like huge big ones. Like the one we have at the house of her, that's the third one, that's a pretty big one. So I mean, maybe those were, she could have gotten more for those probably.
Mhm. Um, Lisa, thanks you for your excellent presentation.
Yeah, but hi, Lisa.
Oh, Natasha as well. Um,
Hey,
and
Natasha.
Louise speculates that perhaps Catherine, stayed at a boarding house whenever she was traveling
Yeah,
in New
it
York.
might have been a boarding house. Yeah, maybe she stayed with friends. Like I said, there's evidence that she had friends from actually from Kentucky that were in New York as well. So they might have been all, board in a board, together. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
And also, I think that when she was in Winchester for a while,
Mhm.
um, she stayed with the family,
Yeah,
possibly that
yeah.
she had been commissioned to do the work for.
Yeah,
And I
and
think
I
she
that
lived
is
for 2
that's
months.
correct. And yeah, so back in Kentucky, if she did that in Winchester. Also, when she painted Lucy Alexander, she stayed at Woodburn Farm for a couple months. So yeah, she could have stayed with the people she was painting as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Laura has a great question. Um, where did Catherine get the money for her studies before she started getting commissions for her work and earning her living doing this?
That's a really good question. Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Her family seems, Ben is off at the railroad, her brother, but I feel like sometimes they had trouble with money, and so that I don't know, not
And
sure.
I'm jumping in here with
Yeah,
my
no,
own comment.
she knows a lot about the Helms, so
Well, I know that in some years, much later, I think there's some letters, more like the 20s and 30s.
mhm,
Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham and Mary Lincoln, sometimes did gift money to the Helms, various members of the Helm family, as birthday gifts and whatnot. So I'm curious if he might have provided some financial support. But
mhm.
also, in the early period of her art studies, her mother Emily had employment.
Yeah.
Correct? She was, well, by then the postmistress in
Right.
Elizabethtown.
Yeah. So yeah, Gwen is talking about, I don't think I mentioned that, but Emily in the 1880s and 1890s was the postmistress in Elizabethtown. So yeah, so she would have had a little bit of money there. So but yeah, no, that's a good question. Don't know yet. Gotta keep searching.
Yeah, she's really fascinating figure who before your work, I think that William Townsend's little booklet on her is the most information that exists. So I
Yeah.
really feel like you added a lot to what we know about Catherine Helm in a very short period of time. I know you could go on for years and years. It's your passion, and I look forward to all that you'll dig up in the future. There are a lot of questions still, and
Hmm.
that's exciting.
Yeah.
Um, next up, Rebecca said, would a family of their social standing allow a daughter to stay in a boarding house? Wouldn't she need a chaperone?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that she was staying in a boarding house. I don't know if that would have been frowned upon or not, but
Well, um, I'm just going to joggle your memory here. Middlesbrough had some interesting information about the unmarried women going to Middlesbrough.
oh yeah,
Um,
I know what you're talking about.
yeah, yeah, you know which one I'm talking about. I'll let you talk then,
Well,
because
no,
I
that
know
you're
you know.
talking about that article about what was the title? You're gonna
Well,
know.
I believe the essence of it is the most important part, which was that Middlesbrough, that the young women, these kind of um,
Mhm.
with some gumption, were heading out to Middlesbrough to kind of make their mark in Middlesbrough. One
Mhm.
of whom they mentioned, I think they mentioned Catherine, and they also mentioned a realtor, a friend of hers.
That was Florence
So
Barlow. Yeah, she was a realtor. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, yeah. So I wonder if she and Florence, when they were already friends and they head off to Middlesbrough, if they perhaps might have uh, shared quarters together.
Oh yeah, I think so. I think she was probably sharing with someone. I'm just not sure it was in a boarding house or not. She was probably sharing an apartment with
Mhm,
someone, but I feel like she was with other people she knew, but
mhm.
that's just a hunch.
Um, Perry has another question. Did Catherine paint the portrait of Tad Lincoln that was early in the presentation?
Oh, yeah, that was just a photograph, actually. So yeah, no. I don't think there's I counted up from what I could find in the newspaper articles and known things, known works of hers to like 85, but I don't think Tad was in the list. But it doesn't mean that it's not out there.
Mhm.
And I'm sure she painted many more than 85. That was just, I have a running tally of what, known works out there.
Mhm.
Any other question?
I am not seeing any other questions. If anyone has any final questions that they'd like to pose, we're happy to take those. It can be on any topic. Okay. Well, it looks like, oh, no, looks like that's the end of the questions. Uh, Again, Kate, I want to thank you for all the work you put into this presentation. Hope that we can continue to share this information with the world. We'll see what that looks like. I think it'd make a fabulous article
Yeah, Tom, I'm
somewhere.
thinking the Kentucky Register, the Kentucky Historical Society Register.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, especially since so much of this information that you found is not something you can read in an existing, secondary source, something that someone has written. It really would add to the historiography, and it would be great to get it in a journal like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Yeah, it's been great. Really enjoyed your presentation, Kate, and I think everyone else did as well.
Yeah, thanks
We're really
everybody for coming.
Yeah, and I really appreciate seeing so many friendly faces, some who are members, donors, colleagues who work in the museum field, board members, just such a variety of the people who are sort of the part of the Mary Todd Lincoln House community. And we're so glad you were with us this evening, and we hope that we will see you again very soon.